True freedom requires the rule of law and justice and a judicial system in which the rights of some are not secured by the denial of rights to others. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is the controversial Prevention of Terrorism Act. Joining us this evening on the show are Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, representing the Centre for Policy Alternatives, Attorney at Law Hijaz Hizbullah, Attorney at Law Chamatkar Ratnayaka, representing the Samik Janabala Vega, as well as Attorney at Law J. Vijay Bandara, representing the National People's Power. Right at the outset, I have to mention, we did invite the Minister in charge of the subject, Minister Vijay Rajapaksa. We also did try to get hold of the State Minister in charge, Anuruddha Jayaratna. We also tried to get hold of a representative from the Attorney General's Department, and also we did invite the Secretary to the Ministry of Justice as well as the Commissioner General of Prisons as well to come and discuss about their side of the story as far as the Prevention of Terrorism Act is concerned. However, none of them did accept our invite. As I always say, time and tide wait for no man. We decided that we will go ahead with our discussing about the controversial Prevention of Terrorism Act. On to my immediate right is Shania Danigama. On to my immediate left is Sharon Benedict, and on to my far left is Ajama Ratnayaka. They would be posing questions to the panelists today. So let's get the ball rolling today with Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, Centre for Policy Alternatives. What are your thoughts on the controversial Prevention of Terrorism Act?
So Shamir, thank you for having me, and again a timely conversation because the government has now come and said they are going to have a new law early next year. And this was, I think, when they had discussions with the European Union around GSP Plus, which was just a couple of days ago. So what we'll have to see is what is this new law going to entail. But if one looks at what's happened in the last couple of months around the PTA, what's worrying is the government said they won't be using it and implementing it, and then went and issued 3 DOs against 3 of those who were involved in the recent protests. So that also raises concerns. They say one thing and they do another thing. But we need to also look at the PTA in terms of what's been enforced for the last few decades. It was a law that was brought in as a temporary measure in 1979. And in 82 it became permanent. But what's interesting is that the law still has this mention of a Temporary Provisions Act. So that also speaks to the fact that it was potentially introduced as something temporary, but it has been used as a targeting, like a weapon against minorities and critics. And we can talk about how it has been used and abused really in the last couple of decades. But interestingly now there's also increasing discourse in the South about repealing the PTA, and that's something interesting to look at, how what has been very much an issue looked at by minorities and opponents and critics have now become a conversation that has really seeped into the society. So I think it's worth looking at what has driven this conversation, and I would say what's happened in the last few months is really critical in terms of changing that discourse. So in that sense, the context of how it has been used, abused, the more recent conversations and potential reforms. The question is then what next happens. So it's a lot of things that we need to dissect and look at. But my concern now is there are several still in detention. The 2 who were recently arrested, one was released. There are 2 still in detention. Their DOs expire end of this month. So the question also to the government is, are they going to renew these detention orders? And on what basis are they going to renew, if they are to renew, or what basis are they being detained? So the narrative now is, are people who are critical of the government going to be targeted using the PTA? Or is it some new law? And also let's remember, it's not just the PTA we should be talking about. There are several other laws also that has been used and abused and targeted critiques. So important to also look at other issues as well.
Thank you very much, Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, representing the Centre for Policy Alternatives. Bhavani is also the senior researcher of the Centre for Policy Alternatives. I now move my attention to Attorney at Law Hijaz Hizbullah. Hijaz, what are your thoughts on the controversial Prevention of Terrorism Act?
Thank you, Shamir, for inviting me and having me here. There is a popular conception or misconception that anyone who calls for the PTA, calls for the repeal of the PTA, is some sort of a traitor, or to use a common parlance, an NGO carrier. But what I'd like to say is that even from the perspective of fighting terrorism, PTA is ineffective. And I'll give you two good examples. One is the Vaunathivu double police murder. Two policemen were killed in Vaunathivu. It was a very controversial killing, and there was a serious question as to who was behind it and how did it happen. The war was over and suddenly two policemen were killed. The CID, Shani Abesekar, in a press interview has stated that the CID received some intelligence which later turned out to be misleading intelligence, saying that the killings, the people behind the killings were two ex-LTT cadres. The two LTT cadres were arrested. One confessed to the murder or to the murders, and he was in detention for a year. And then we had the Easter Sunday bomb blast. Investigations into the Easter Sunday bomb blast revealed that actually the guy who confessed was actually not involved, and it was somebody else. So the PTA actually stopped the investigation from happening. If those two LTT cadres were produced before a magistrate and the normal judicial process was played out, where they'll have their lawyers and this whole thing will be re-scrutinized independently before a magistrate, possibly the CID and everybody involved in the process would have realized we've got the wrong guys. And that would have led to the right guys being caught and possibly the Easter Sunday bomb blast not happening. Same thing happened with regard to the All Saints Church Boralla incident. June 12th, the grenade was found. June 13th, the police reported that they found the mastermind, and that was the sacristan, and that he had used a 13-year-old boy. Now, the question that I want to pose to every single person who's watching this show, do you want to live in a country like that, where you have these absurd laws producing absurd results, people who did not commit crimes confess to it? So this is the reason. I mean, it's not just about these are just human rights advocates, they just taken money from a foreign government and they're coming here and talking all this liberal nonsense. No, it's not about that. It's about having a society that we can live in, a society that is reasonable, not a society that produces absurd things. And it's absurd, right? Where people who did not commit crimes confess and they face trial and their lives are ruined and all of that. So, and even recently we had 3 people released, acquitted of all charges after 16 years. I mean, is that something we want to live with? So that's I think my position. PTA ought to be repealed. And
thanks a lot, Hijaz, for your thoughts. But before I move on to Chamatkar, a very quick question to you. I want an open-ended answer. Do you confess that you are a victim of the Prevention of Terrorism Act that has been enacted in Sri Lanka for some time now?
Of course I am. There's nothing to confess, Shamil. I am a victim, and I hope during the discussion that I'll be able to show how it victimizes not just me, and how it victimizes not just me, but victimizes a lot of people.
Well, thank you very much, Attorney at Law Hijaz Hizbullah. I now move my attention to Attorney at Law Chamatkar Ratnayaka, representing the Samag Janabalavegya. Chamatkar, what are your thoughts on the PTA?
First of all, thank you for having me on the show. And I also think that it's a privilege to be among esteemed defenders of human rights today. As a young politician myself, I think I would like to tie in what I think about the PTA with the party stance on it as well. I think the SJB has always taken a very strong stance that the PTA should be repealed and should be replaced with counter-terrorism measures that are in line with international human rights obligations. I think a piece of legislation that was introduced as a temporary measure has been used for decades in a very draconian manner to suppress differing voices, be it minority or majority voices. It's been used to suppress opponents of government. It's been used to suppress minorities. It's been used to suppress human rights defenders. And I think there is increasing consensus even among the public that this must go. And I think there is a need for political will among the politicians, among those representing us in Parliament, to actually repeal and replace this piece of legislation. It's not just this. I think right now the government is using a lot of archaic laws that weren't made for its purpose to suppress legitimate dissent, and giving national security concerns as an excuse for a lot of things. And we saw some amendments presented to the PTA in January this year. And I think the SJB, as well as many opposition parties, viewed these amendments as merely tokenistic. It wasn't addressing the root of the issue. It wasn't addressing any of the issues with regard to arbitrary detention or the way of obtaining confessions or arrest without warrant or the way prisoners are treated in detention or the wide-ranging powers that the ministers have under the PTA. So the SJB's proposal was actually to start off with the Law Commission proposal in 2016, the Protection of National Security Bill that was drafted by the Law Commission in 2016, to use that as a starting point to then pass a piece of legislation that is not contrary to international human rights standards, protects national security, has a very strong watertight counterterrorism provisions, but also protects human rights. So, and I also like to point out that even in the south of this country, I represent Monoragala. I saw that when Mr. Shanaki and Rasamanikam and Mr. Sumantri went around the country collecting signatures against the PTA to repeal the PTA, there is increased consensus among especially young people in the south that this is not a piece of legislation that just affects minorities, but affects Sri Lankans as a whole.
Thank you very much, Shamatka, for your remarks in the first round. I now move my attention to Attorney at Law J.M. Vijay Bandara, representing the National People's Power.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me today. I begin with, we always for people-friendly constitution, which is a major thing that right now we have been lacking. From 1978 onward, though we enacted the Second Republic Constitution, there are many ad hoc amendments to that constitution. So the spirit of the democracy, spirit of the human right has been vanished due to this ad hoc amendment, including up to 22nd Amendment. The constitutionalism means no organs of government or no person should be placed above the law. That is the latest developed constitutional principle. Previously, of course, we discussed the supremacy of parliament, sovereignty of people. The latest novel concept is that constitutionalism, that means by the constitution itself, by words or by provision, shall not allow any person or organs of government to be above the law. That is the guideline principle. So we are talking about a people-friendly constitution. So we need a clear, totally a new constitution which adhere to this concept. Constitution is the supreme law. President, parliament, even the judiciary for that matter, shall not be above the constitution. All comes under the constitution. If I explain further and elaborate, if president can pardon with keeping his immunity the convicted person, that means president as a person is above the constitution. Constitution black letter provide for that. So that is a bad constitution. So right now our constitution is bad constitution. If we come to directly to this PTA, this has been enacted in the year 1979, during which period we had no threat whatsoever about terrorism. 1979. After landscape victory for one party, they enacted this. Subsequently, of course, there were certain terrorist problems. Now, this is still prevail. And the Constitution says, Article 4 of the Constitution, the all organs of government shall promote, secure the human rights set out in Chapter 3, including freedom of expression, freedom of movement. Then also there are certain rational limitations introduced by Chapter 3 itself. If the national defense is in jeopardy, then rational basis human right can be restricted. So Constitution itself provides for that. So we don't need any other piece of legislation to restrict fundamental rights of people, including liberty not being arrested. This piece of legislation only permit to override the Constitution and give undue discriminatory powers, discretion on the executive to use this law. For example, this says, I will stop saying this, this says specified persons, PTA, that has interpretation. It's including the president, judges of apex court, etc. Now you remember Justice Abhay PTA was murdered after his work. Then that case was tried under normal law. They should have tried under this act, but why they didn't do, that has nothing to do with politics in the country. They always try to harass political opponents using this piece of legislation.
Thank you very much, Attorney at Law J. Vijay Bandara, representing the National People's Power. I open the floor for questions from our journalist right at the outset itself. Again, I'll introduce them to you very quickly. On to my immediate right is Shania, on to my immediate left is Shalin, on to my far left is Jamal. Let's get the ball rolling with the lady. Yes, let's start off with Shania.
Thank you, Shamir. My question is directed to Mr. Hizbullah. I think you touched on the ineffectiveness of the PTA, right? Do you in fact believe that the law promotes terrorism and sows seeds of rebellion and revolt because it suffocates dissent? It's repressing freedom of expression, and do you believe that it's actually having a counterproductive effect?
I would say I do believe that, and of course there is no data on this, and that's a huge problem we have in our country on this issue, is that we do not have enough research. I think CPA has done a lot, but a really careful analysis as to how the PTA has worked and its real effect and impact.
But Mr. Hizbullah, just playing a little bit of the devil's advocate here, since much of the opinions expressed during the first round were against the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Let's say, for example, matters of terrorism in this country are dealt under normal law. Bail Act would apply. A suspect would have to be produced in a magistrate's court within 24 hours, meaning a police officer has only 24 hours to conduct an investigation. Do you think that's sufficient? Do you think that's enough?
Shalan, firstly, it's 72 hours, right? That's number one. So do we need the PTA? Let's get to that. Now, in 1979, when the law was enacted, it was enacted as a temporary measure, and then it became a permanent law. And now we are of the impression, now everybody's on the impression that since we've had a terrorism law, we must continue to have it, right? But there is, but I want to adopt what I would say a proportionality analysis to the law, because that's another question about how do you make it humane, how do you make it acceptable. Now, all these questions will have to be answered in the context of threat. It's only how big is this threat, how much of a threat, and also when you listen to the government and some government talking about this issue, they talk about international standards. But why international standards? Is it the US or UK? But their threats are different. We don't go fighting wars all over the world. So what is the threat that we have? So if you take, going back to my proportionality analysis, we know it has three main limbs. One, we see what the issue is. Then we consider the measures that are available, and then we come up with a measure that is least human rights restrictive.
But Mr. Hizbullah, do you think we're focusing more on...
Yes.
Yes.
So the point is, what is the threat now? Do we really have a terrorism threat here?
Do we not have a terrorism threat here?
I don't know, but that's something I think the media and politicians like Chamatka need to be thinking about. Do we really have a threat here, and how big is that threat?
I
Now,
think
if
that's
we
where
do-
my question comes in. Is it sowing seeds of rebellion because there is so much suppression?
But isn't there always a threat of terrorism in any country?
No,
Given
I think
the definition of terrorism is quite loose.
I would say that needs. I'm not in a position to answer that because obviously that requires a much more careful consideration of security issues, and there are people better capable of answering those questions, and that's what the media and the political parties need to think about it. But any discussion on the PTA must be first predicated on a careful or a proper statement of a real threat. It cannot be hypothetical. It cannot be we've had it, so how can we get rid of it? No, we need to have a terror law. So first, we as a society need to understand and agree that yes, there is a serious terrorism threat. That's what happened in 1979. In 1975, Alfred Durayappa was shot dead. LTT was functioning. By 1977, armed groups were operating. 1971, there was a JVP insurrection. There was no PTA. There was no PTA in 1971. 1975, Alfred Durayappa. 1977, LTT armed groups were operating. 3 years on, government brought in a 1-year temporary measure. Now we are in 2022. Now what is the threat? Can we have the same honest conversation about it?
But if you look at it, Hijaz, right after the end of the conflict in 2009, we were saying everything was hunky-dory. We've ended a war, we've ended a conflict, we are now free, we are a free nation, so on and so forth. But what happened in 2019, April 21st? It was a rewind of what we experienced as a nation with regard to terrorism. It was the Easter Sunday bomb attacks. Who have conducted or who carried out the attacks is a different story altogether. But at the end of the day, there was a threat even at that time. And we are discussing about the Prevention of Terrorism Act 3 years after under that backdrop. Don't forget about that.
Well, again, Shamil, so we had the PTA in 2019, right? It didn't stop the attack. Right? It didn't stop the attack. We could have stopped it, and that's my point about the Vaunativo example. We could have stopped it. So what's going on here? Oh, I don't have the answers, but those are the questions that we need to be asking, and that's the dialogue needs to be focusing on, right? And that's why I started off with the Vaunativo example. If not for the PTA, maybe we would have stopped the Easter Sunday bombings. If those ex-LTT cadres were produced before the magistrate, if they had access to lawyers, if they were able to show this is a misleading intelligence report, these guys have got the wrong guys, maybe the investigation would have been leveled up, strengthened, and they would have gone after several other leads, and that would have led to Zahran Hashim, who now we know as is the person who was behind it.
I think, Mr. Hizbullah, taking a little bit of a leaf from what you said before, you said common parlance, people think that there are NGO-funded people, NGO Karyo, you know, shouting and saying, repeal the PTA, repeal the PTA, repeal the PTA. But Bhavani, I'd like to direct this question to you now. When you say terrorism, people are a little bit shifty on the definition of a terrorist, because the word terrorist is not defined in the PTA. There is very little definition of it found even in international law, simply because of the fact that there's a very thin line between a terrorist and a patriot. And that could be winning a civil war. So how do you define a terrorist?
And a thin line between a citizen and an extremist. You know, I think we're hearing various terminology used. And I think it goes back to what's the purpose, no? What is the real objective of even these conversations? And I want to just take a step back, because we always have these conversations around repeal PTA, and that becomes the conversation, whether it should be repeal, whether it should be reform. But this point about, and it goes back to the point he just also has been raising, is why are we even having this conversation? And in 2018, I want to go back to this reform process, because at that time the government initiated a counter-terror law, which was to replace the PTA, and that was Hijaz, as several others. We challenged it in court because we found that also problematic. So there is this notion that you replace one with another, and that's meant to address the problems. But it doesn't go to the root causes of the problem. It doesn't also address the problems in a holistic manner. Because we come, and as lawyers, I think it's also quite interesting that we think a law is going to address all these societal problems. It doesn't. I mean, let's recognize it. The fact that, you know, if you're thinking about changing mindsets, practices, society, how society addresses issues, it's a bigger issue than bringing in a law.
That's actually what I was thinking too, Bhavani. I'd like to move just to Chamatka for one thing. Don't you think that there's nothing really wrong with the PTA? It's how politicians, since you are a part of the group now, it's how politicians use the PTA, because the PTA has provisions for expedited trials for detainees under the PTA, simply to, well, make the law more expeditious in these matters, give them priority. But that seems to be the only provision that the police officers or whoever responsible for prosecuting these cases don't seem to abide by. So even if the PTA was in place and there were politicians, or not politicians in this case, but police officers and law enforcement officials who use this act properly, wouldn't that make a world of difference?
I think the problem here, as with politicians, as with governments wanting to suppress voices, is also the act itself, Charlene, that gives a very broad definition of who a terrorist is, gives very broad arbitrary powers to state officials, that doesn't allow for judicial oversight. So I think those are things, so for a politician, for the government to abuse that power, that it needs to be within that piece of legislation that is not watertight, that allows the government to use that piece of legislation in an arbitrary manner. So I think it's important to address that, but also like Bhavani said, it's not just about replacing one piece of legislation with another. It's about thinking about where we are as a society, addressing things holistically. Yes, we don't have a war, we don't have physical militants fighting on the ground, but what about new advents of terrorism? What about things like cyber terrorism that we don't think of? Also, if you look at the world, Charlene, if you look at a lot of the developed world, a lot of counterterrorism laws in the world were tightened after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. It was as a reactionary measure, right? So we need to think of, if policymakers in this country, if lawmakers in this country are merely making policies and laws in a reactionary, arbitrary manner as well. Are we addressing things holistically, or just doing it in a tokenistic reactionary matter?
So, Mr. Hizbullah, I'm sorry, I wanted to talk to you about how productive this apex counter-terrorism law is. It's the Prevention of Terrorism Act is widely considered the premier counter-terrorism law in the country. However, I was going through the preamble of this law itself, and it says, whereas public order in Sri Lanka continues to be endangered by elements of groups of persons or associations that advocate the use of force to accomplish governmental change. So if counter-terrorism and protecting civilians from indiscriminate violence is the objective of the PTA, why does the preamble in itself say that this is used to accomplish, this is used to protect the interest of the state? So how effective is the PTA in terms of safeguarding civilians? Doesn't this show that this is merely a law that protects the interests of the state?
You're right. You're right to a great extent, because if you look at the biggest problem we have, and that's something that Mr. Vijay Bandara also pointed out, is that is the selective application of the PTA, right?
Yes.
The law does not set out, the law does not have definition of what terrorism is. The law does not set out boundaries where it will be used. In January 2022, the government produced certain amendments, and whilst presenting the amendments to Parliament, Professor G.L. Piri said, we are very clear, we are not going to use it unless exceptional circumstances. And he also brought in the example that even if an offensive weapon is used, the PTA will not be used. even if an offensive weapon like a gun is used in the commission of the offense in question, we will not be using the PTA unless there is a real terrorism element to it. But then here we have Vasanta Mudalige. Right? So and when they were arrested, the reasoning was the violence that happened post May 9th, the burning of the VIP houses. But those who were actually arrested for burning VIP houses were granted bail and sent home. So your point is correct. So who are we protecting? Who are we using the PTA to protect? And also this issue about one thing I saw with my personal experience going through the process is the confidence with which the law enforcement authorities act under the PTA. Because there is no judicial scrutiny at all until you have an indictment and the High Court judge is hearing evidence. And during the process of hearing evidence, which is like 7-8 years down the pipeline, that the judge realizes that this has been unjust. Like in the case of the 3 detainees who were inmates with me at the New Magazine prison, and they told me that that when the judge was listening to the evidence, he said, "Why did it take so long?"
Yeah, but just for disclosure case, whatever statements that you are making with regard to individual sentiments that have been expressed to you, you have to bear full responsibility for
Yes,
the statements that you are making. So I thought I'll just make sure that I remind you about that, because there's an ongoing court case and you are due to appear on the 24th of November as well. So keep that in mind when you're making your statements today in public. Right, you can continue.
Yes.
Bhavani,
Go ahead.
Bhavani, if I may pose a question just before Jaima takes the floor. The EU's GSP Plus has been the scheme, the tariff-free access to the European Union. They've been pressurizing Sri Lanka on amending the PTA and to set up truth and reconciliation mechanisms. In response, President Ranil Wickremesinghe has set up what he calls the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, modeled after South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this model allocates people to accept or reject allegations, to obtain death certificates, to repeal actions. Is it a way to bring about closure, do you think? Is it effective? How effective a response is it to the pressure that we are getting from the international community?
So 2 things. The EU GSP Plus is very specific. It's trade preference, and it has labor standards, human rights standards, and environment. The TRC comes through the UNHRC conversations at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. There was a resolution recently passed, and the government in those conversations said they're going to come up with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That again is not a new conversation. That's captured in the 2015 resolution, when then government, when the president, now president, was the prime minister, committed to 4 mechanisms. So the TRC conversation has been there for several years. The TRC model that was used in South Africa and Latin America and several other countries serves a particular purpose of truth-telling and truth-seeking. Now, many of us who've been working on this for years, for decades, have asked the question, do we really need a TRC in Sri Lanka? When we've had countless commissions of inquiry, we had the LLRC that went around the country, we had the Parnagama Commission, we've had so many. So there is sufficient information from existing mechanisms that have established particular patterns. Patterns to show that accountability is an issue. Impunity is the issue in Sri Lanka. So, I mean, my question when the government came up with the TRC in 2015 as well as now is, why are you pushing TRC when we need to address accountability and we need to address structural reforms?
So, Mr. Vijay Bandara, I want to just draw on that and ask you, because you represent the National People's Power and the JVP essentially, and the JVP and the wider NPP has been more or less known as the watchdog in terms of exposing corruption in the country, malfeasance, misfeasance, whatnot. So, in terms of impunity, in terms of repealing this law and, like you rightly mentioned, the supremacy of the constitution, how would you, under a government of the NPP, go about ensuring that this is realized?
Yeah. What we have to achieve is the accountability. Now, even under PTA, what is the accountability of the arresting officer or the investigation officer after 1.5 years or 2 years? If a suspect is discharged, thereafter what? Nothing at the moment. So what is the major issue is lacking the accountability and all the existing mechanism of governance, including parliament.
So what does the JJB propose to address this accountability?
Let me answer this first. Accountability. Now parliament itself is struggling how to trace 10 dual citizens. I mean, there is no enforcement mechanism. I mean, you can pass many laws. Now the constitution was amended. Preventing dual citizen coming, that is a supreme law, but there are no mechanism, no authority to impose that. Who is accountable? The speaker said, I cannot take step. So that is what is the major problem. So we can introduce many pieces of law and same time we can bend the law.
No, but Mr. Vijayabandara, I recollect in your opening remarks you said something very interesting. You said when the 1979 piece of legislation on the Prevention of Terrorism Act came into play, there was not a situation of terrorism in the country. You said that in your opening remarks. Yes. However, in his remarks for subsequently, he just mentioned about the fact how Alfred Dorapa, the mayor of Jaffna, was gunned down by youth in 1975, and the environment was created at that time. So do you want to respond to Hijaz on that?
I differ from to a certain extent. Now, we cannot pass laws for occasional incidents. Even 2019 East attacks, I say it is an occasional incident. You can follow every that in the cricket, every shot if you place the field, you lose the match. Likewise, there may be instances where it's...
But the environment needs to be created, isn't it?
Environment needs to be created. During that time, we had our Security Council in operation. We have all the intelligence services in operation. There may be a lacuna somewhere, but that cannot be filled up by passing Prevention of Terrorism Act or emergency law. So, I mean, they are expert. They are accountable to the society.
I think we have agreed on this. I think Mr. Vijayabandara and I agreed on one point. The fact that the key point is we're talking 2022. And we're talking about what are we going to do next. And the point that we'd like to say is we need to look at what's happening right now. And are we going to say that there is a serious need for a law at the present situation? I think that's the main point here.
But in 1979, there was a situation to bring about an act of this sort. However, whether to continue with it is a big question mark. Are we in agreement on that as far as the two gentlemen and the two ladies are concerned?
Well, Shamir, I mean, let's remember the PTA was brought in as a temporary measure. It was introduced as a temporary measure.
Agreed.
And that was what the government said of the day, and there was a sunset clause which was removed in '82. So we need to remember the context. It has just become normalized where people just assume you have to have a terrorism law just willy-nilly that so anyone can use it.
Chapatka, in your opening remarks, you said something very interesting. You said that the position of the SJB is to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Am I right?
Yes.
Right. However, the SJB was part of the Good Governance government in 2015.
Yep.
What effort, now if you look at the SJB as a whole, there were a lot of members who were representing the UNP at that time who have now crossed over and formed a different political party altogether. That's a different story altogether. However, you mentioned about the SJB's position. What were these members of parliament doing from 2015 to 2020 until the government fell? Were they sleeping?
That's a good question. I think that's part of the reason why certain members of the then said UNP left the UNP and formed the SJB first of all. But I think there were efforts compared to other consecutive governments that had come about till 2015. I think there were efforts.
But that's not the reason. That's not the reason. That's not the reason. Yeah, wait, that's not the reason the SJB fell out with Ranil Wickremesinghe in 2020. The PTA was not the issue. It was something else.
I think there was a lack of internal party democracy, and also
it was not the PTA.
There was a lack of internal party democracy, but also there were disagreements on other fronts, which led to a breakaway. I think I'd like to answer the question.
Yeah, like the PTA.
And I think that there is an environment that's been created through emblematic cases like of the gentleman sitting on my right. There's a general public consensus around issues like this that allows a political party also to then push for reform. And I think, speaking of Yahapalana from 2015 to 18,
tell me several members of the SJB now who were then part of the UNP government who raised issues with regard to the PTA. Tell me a few members of parliament at that time. I will take your point as a case in point. If you tell me several members of the SJB now who were holding portfolios under the Good Governance government who spoke about the repealing of the PTA.
I think I can think of one Mr. Iran Wickramaratne who's spoken out on this issue since his entry into parliament. So,
but see, the issue seems to be the lack of political will, as you quite rightly pointed out in the opening round. So, Mr. Hizbullah, Bhavani, you guys are not from the political sphere. You guys are not officially politicians yet.
No, unofficially.
There's nothing official. We are not.
But when it comes to, you have been advocates for human rights and protecting human rights in Sri Lanka, and specifically in this case, the repeal of the PTA. The lady and the gentleman, of course, on your left, they are politicians. So would you believe it when they come to this forum and say that they will repeal the PTA given that their party is elected into power and hopefully have a majority power? Would you believe
because
that? How would you?
It's come up from time to time as an election promise. Come election season, all of these promises emerge.
So would you believe them is the answer? Would you believe the lady and the gentleman?
Well, Sharon, can I just say there are lots of promises politicians make in the lead up to elections. Do we believe all of it? I don't personally believe all of it. But what I'll do is, if there is genuine interest at reforms, I will work with anyone who is interested in genuine reforms.
How do you?
Just because there's been empty promises doesn't mean we stop. Because we don't trust one, or one failed or a few failed, then we won't have anything. If you look at even just the constitution reforms, the promises have been there for example, devolution of power. Where are we now? So similar to PTA reforms, repeal, all of that, so many promises have been made by successive governments, so many politicians. But do we stop engaging because we may not trust one? No, I would say we engage knowing there's going to be a long road ahead. But we also look at what we can take out of things in the past where some reforms have gone to some extent, and then at least try not to repeat those mistakes. So if there is an opportunity to repeal the PTA, let's take it. Regardless of who's in government, let's take it, because I don't think we can be beggars and wait for that perfect moment.
So,
no, we can't.
Bhavan, now you're saying that we've been discussing about repealing the PTA for some time now. Chamatka says that Iran Wickramaratne, in his capacity as a member of parliament, initially spoke about the PTA, but I can't find any remarks he made. But if Chamatka is privy to that information, I'm well and glad about it. However, the reason being, now you said next year we are looking at repealing the PTA.
Well, the government
is saying. The government has been saying this over and over again. Bhavani, you've been attached to the CPA for some time now. You've been doing a lot of work in terms of the PTA. We've seen that. Even Pakir Saranamuthu, your executive director, has filed a lot of cases against it as well. But can you believe politicians? Because when the politicians are in power, they are mum about it. When they're in opposition, they speak about it. That's the order of the day, and that's the truth. Where were these politicians when between 2015 and 2019, when there was opportunity for good change in the country? All of them were mum.
Well,
no one spoke about it.
Well, no, I want to correct you there, and I speak as someone who had engaged with the counter-terror, the reform process, and engaged to the point where we went before Parliament, the committee that looked into it, and that committee was headed by SJB MP, and there were several of the government members present in that committee who actually, I personally believe, were genuinely interested in taking it forward. That was in 2018. Easter Sunday happened in 2019 and that process ended. So I don't think it's quite right to say that those members of parliament, or at least some of them in the Yahapalana government, were not interested. It's just other aspects played in. I'm not speaking to individuals, I'm speaking from my own experience. But do we trust, do we engage? And this whole point of we've seen this over and over again, and I go back to the point. Do we stop because a couple of people have made promises and didn't carry through? No, we don't. We continue to engage, we continue to challenge. You're quite right, we've been in court several times, even this year when the amendments were proposed by the government. We challenged the PTA amendment because we felt it didn't meet the basic standards. We will have to continue doing it, not just CPA, but as citizens it's important. And that's the difference now. There are more and more people questioning, critiquing, challenging, and that's something we need to be very, very aware of. And I think that could start a process of holding politicians accountable.
So, Samakka, in terms of holding politicians accountable, you said that several members of parliament who are now in the SJB, formerly in the Good Governance government, have actually advocated for repealing the PTA. So, if the SJB does come into power in the near future, can you give us a guarantee that the PTA will be repealed? Can you give us a timeline of when you guys will initiate this process and basically ensure that this will not be another broken promise?
Rama, what I can communicate to you is what's been communicated to me, and I don't think I as an individual can vouch for an entire political party or government that is to come into power.
But don't you think it should be done by...
But SJB stand now, if it changes when it comes to government, that is problematic itself. And I think that then it's up to the people to hold them accountable. Because I think if the people do vote for the SJB based on this promise and certain other promises, it is up to the people of this country to hold a political party accountable as well. But as with general accountability, like Bhavani said, people are holding political parties and political actors accountable. And I don't think we live in a climate, especially post-Aragalaya, where people are asking for reform, accountability, where a political party could go back on their promises. But there is a certain authoritarian government now with a very large majority that keeps contradicting itself day in and day out. So I think...
Can you give us an assurance that if the SJB does come to power...
Jayaman, I don't think it's fair to ask Chamatka whether she can give an assurance because of the fact that she's not a parliamentarian or she's not in that political authority to take a decision of that.
But at least she can communicate it to those in power.
Let's leave that for the moment, but I just want to quickly ask, before moving on to Shania, with regard to the question that we have received from our viewers, a very quick question to Mr. Vijay Bandara. Mr. Vijay Bandara, what is the stand of the NPP? Now, we've heard the stand of the SJB. Yes. We would have loved to hear the thoughts of the government as well. Unfortunately, all of them are running away and shying away from appearing on the media at the moment. However, what is the stand of the NPP?
The NPP doesn't say that we will repeal PTA or we will introduce 23rd Amendment. That is not our policy. And country has suffered on rotation various problems, and day by day what we witness today is every problem has been aggravated. Major problem right now we face after Aragalaya, the entire system has collapsed to a level that nobody is accountable, including small school. Now you see the principal complained to police about 5-year-old or grade 5 students, and then police take control over hand. But after that, what will happen after 2 weeks?
You're not answering my question now. We are specifically talking about the Prevention of Terrorism Act.
Yes.
Are you trying to tell us that the NPP does not have a stand on the Prevention of Terrorism Act?
PTA is a bad
because
that's
there are,
very clear.
Because
So, but does that mean that you are not going to repeal
No,
the
not.
PTA? Is that a
I
blanket
didn't say
statement?
that not going to repeal. I
Then-
didn't say that we are going to implement this.
Okay.
This is a bad law.
because there are a lot of
yes.
issues concerning the NPP, because the NPP sometimes says that they have a plan for the country's economy and they don't have it. They've never spoken
I am a
about
lawyer.
it.
I will talk only about the
Yeah,
law and
law.
good
So that's
governance, please.
Prevention of Terrorism Act is all something of that sort. What is the option? What is the way out?
Yes.
If you all have to communicate something to the international community, what would that communication be?
I don't say that we need PTA to govern the country, and I always don't give promise that we will remove PTA. That's why I say we will introduce new amendment to the constitution. That is not how we have to look at the problem. The entire problem, first problem is we have to set up a clear constitution whereby the constitution is supreme law, all the agencies of government comes under that
Right.
in an accountable manner. So we are in the process of preparation of a new constitution with expert input.
So are you
Without
saying
which,
the NPP is in the process of drafting a new constitution.
so we have to address this issue because we don't have clear
No,
constitution.
but do
right
you
now.
have a constitution?
Do you have a
show to the
committee?
people?
Do you have a committee working on it? How does that work?
Yes, we do have a separate committee. Even the constitutional reforms, we have a committee. We are working.
you
on it.
But
name a
will
few
you get to
members,
work on it, Mr. Vijay Bandara, if and when you do come into power, or are you all bringing it forward to the people
No,
and showing
certainly it has to be
this is what we have, this is
Certainly
what
it
we
has
will
to be put
enact
into the
when we
paper
and
for
if we
dialogue.
do come into
We
power?
will be doing it. And today we are talking only PTA. No? I am not asked to talk about new constitutional amendment that we are going to. But this piecemeal solution, I say, will not work. We have enough examples of that
So
effect.
we have some questions from our viewers. Shana, do you want to take a few of them?
Yes, I'll pose one to Mr. Hizbullah. The government has repeatedly said that it does not oppose the freedom of speech. However, it believes that there are certain terrorist elements embedded in the protest movements that sweep across the country from time to time. Is it not fair in this context that the state uses the PTA to snuff out these elements?
So there are terrorist elements. The question is that there are terrorist elements
That the
who are.
government believes that there are terrorist elements embedded within the protest movements.
What did they do? Protest? Is that a terrorist act? So if the
That depends on your definition of what
exactly,
terrorist, right?
exactly, and that's the problem here,
Yeah.
Can
and
be-
that's the problem. So there are terrorist elements in the protest movement. We hear what's happening in Iran. They're calling it terrorism, and they're giving life sentences to those who engaged in protests. So it's all about labeling, and that goes back to my original point. Do you want to be in a country like that? Is that the kind of society you want to live in, where somebody decides that this is terrorism and locks you up for 16 years? When all you've done is do what anybody else did.
Mr. Hizbullah, I agree on the fact that it shouldn't be targeting individuals, political opponents, that's all fine. But does that mean the fact that the PTA is being used the wrong way, does that mean that that discretion, that power to identify an uprising, because, well, we've been through several uprisings, the JVP uprising in '83 at the time, then the LTTE uprising, all of those, it wasn't started off as, one day people wake up and then they have these arms lying around them and they take up and then they go to war. That's not how it started. It started off as small, pockets of rebellion, and that's really how it developed. So the fact that the PTA is being used in the wrong way, does that mean that the discretion shouldn't exist in toto?
No, I mean that goes on even in criminal law as a whole, right? There is discretion, but that discretion is also tightly supervised. Now the problem with the PTA, right, is a complete absence of judicial supervision of the investigation. There's an important difference of a judicial supervision of the investigation. What are the statements you're recording? What is evidence you've recorded against this individual? That kind of supervision that the magistrate performs in a normal criminal case is absent in the PTA. Secondly, there is no judicial supervision of detention. That's also in a normal law that we have it. right? So we have, if you produce a person, police will object to bail, the judge will examine facts, and he will decide, no, I need to keep this guy in, or I'm going to let this guy out. So there is, every civilized society encounters the same questions that you're posing at me, and they have answers, right? And one of the key aspects of how we respond to that is judicial supervision, right? And then there are various parameters, right? Some are extremely easy, and then absolutely nothing, like the PTA. Now then, where do we fix it? Where do we put ours? Right? Do we bring it here or do we put it there? And that is where I talk about proportionality. What's the issue now? And then where
what
do you
about
fix it?
what about for
Now,
a
that
person who'd
discussion
say,
we need to have.
what's the issue now? What about if a person says, well, Sri Lanka is undergoing an economic crisis, people are uneasy, people are easily aggravated. I think despite of all the things that the Aragale resulted in Sri Lanka gaining some sort of stability afterwards with the change in government, with the change in president, there was an element of violence involved there. It would have been prompted by various other factions and various other reasons, but there was an element of violence involved there. So for a person who says, well, we're living in a time when Sri Lanka is a bankrupt state, there is growing, dissent against the government. There are certain factions in government that says we can't have elections because we don't have money. So elections are, well, at least for now, not anywhere close. So there is a tendency for the people to revolt, rebel. How would you respond?
I think people rebelling in the, people coming out and protesting, occupying public spaces and talking to the world and to the government that seemed tone deaf at that time, I don't think that's terrorism. That's number one, right? And if there is, something thrown here or something, this thing, the penal code can apply. You need the PTA and to detain a person for 1.5 years for that? Do you need that? I mean, is that what you need to deal with a hungry man burning a loaf of bread in front of the presidential secretariat? You need to have Vasanta Mudalige for and the student leaders. What did they do? Whereas we have people who are engaging in acts of arson, released on bail. So the people who did the arson and on the 5th lane house of the current president have been given bail. So if you are okay with that, and we as a society,
arson is a serious offence.
Exactly, they're being given bail. So what PTA are you? What terrorism law are you talking about? And this is the problem. This is the problem. And also, on this question of terrorism, I was with LTT Tamil political prisoners. I wouldn't say LTT, but Tamil political prisoners for 1 year. An important thing that I need to ask is, we also saw other known LTT leaders not facing the law at all.
Yes,
and that made me very sad, actually, to see these guys inside for years, and others the law did not even apply to them.
You're talking about individuals in the caliber of Kumar and Padmanathan, for an example?
I'll leave it to you to sort that out.
So Bhavani, do you think...
Jaiman, with your permission, I just want to, because we have Hijaz today here on the show, if we leave Hijaz tonight without asking about his experience as a prevention of terrorism act victim, I think we would be not doing justice by our viewers tonight. Hijaz, tell us very briefly, I'll give you 2 minutes. Tell us a little bit about your experience as a prevention of terrorism act victim in Sri Lanka, because when I asked you this question in your opening remarks, you said, yes, I am a victim, because we've seen this a lot on the papers, published elsewhere. We've seen this. That's what I want to ask you from the horse's mouth itself. Tell us a little bit about your experience as a prevention of terrorism act victim.
Firstly, Shamir, I want to say my experience is not the experience of the ordinary detainee, right? I had a lot going for me. I was a lawyer. I had friends who were lawyers. The international community was talking about me. Social media was talking about me. So my experience is entirely different, right? But I'd like to talk about the ordinary, what I saw, right? And I think it's a very, very sad and difficult existence. It's a very sad and very difficult existence. Basically, one thing that was told to me was that your life is over, and that's quite possible.
Who told you that?
The CID.
The CID told you directly?
The people who, and that's part of extracting confessions, is to inform your detainee your life is over, and that makes sense. And you know how they say life is over? We will keep you in detention for 18 months.
That's based on the PTA.
PTA. Then we produce you before a magistrate at the end of the 18 months, and the magistrate will remand you. The magistrate has no option but to remand. The magistrate will remand you, and you will go in for remand custody. And then you wait until your indictment turns up. Your indictment will turn up a year, 2 years, 3 years, and some cases even 5 years later. So until that 5-year period, you're there. And then your High Court trial commences. Until the January amendments came in, there was no bail before the High Court unless the AG consented. So basically, AG gave you bail. So then the High Court trial goes on. And the High Court trial, like in the recent case of the three persons who were acquitted after 16 years. So basically, once you get arrested and they stick that label of PTA on you, you are in, your life is over, and you're in for 16 years.
Are you happy, Hijaz, that you are somewhat of a free man now? I'm not saying totally. We saw Rishad Badruddin, who was acquitted from the Easter Sunday bomb attacks recently as well. At least now it seems that action is being taken by the government in power with regard to such detainees. So do you think that you are somewhat of a free man?
Certainly, I'm not a free man as such, because as you pointed out, Shamid, earlier, is that I have a case going on.
Yeah.
And a
you
case
are to appear on the 24th of
on the
November
24th, and a case, and as you pointed out, yeah, that is restrictive of me. I need to be careful with what I say. I need to be careful with what I do. I need to be careful where I go. I need to be careful as to what I'm doing, because this is hanging over my head.
Right? Mr. Hizbullah, you were speaking about judicial oversight over these matters. Now, you have faith in the judiciary.
Yes, of course.
Given your position as an attorney at law and all of that.
Not just as an attorney at law, as a person who's been subject, that's a point that I want to highlight. As a person who's been subject to the process, I must say the judicial officers who heard my cases did a fantastic job, and they really were able to look through a lot of these issues. So certainly, the judiciary is something that we can keep a lot of faith in.
So Mr. Hizbullah, how important is judicial oversight in this matter in terms of ensuring the rights and liberties of anyone who is charged under the PTA is protected? Why is the judiciary's role being displaced under the PTA? Why does this keep happening? Because...
Okay, two questions. One is, why is the judicial role so important, and why is it being displaced? Why is it so important? I can give you a good reason. When a person is arrested, he is kept in custody for 72 hours. He has to be produced before the magistrate. Magistrate, when he is produced before the magistrate, they do produce what is called a B report. And a B report has to produce summary of statements that have been recorded, the evidence, and also what type of allegations are being made against him, and the evidence. So that is a starter. So if there's no case, the judge will say there is no case. So that's where judicial supervision is important, and I think I'm not violating any rule in saying that in my case, the first statement, which was also not incriminating, was recorded 6 days after my arrest. 6 days. Now, if the normal law had been applied to me, I would have been produced before the judge 3 days later, and the police would have said, we have nothing against him, we have to let him go. So that is where judicial supervision is important.
But Mr. Hizbullah, where I was heading to was the fact that if we have so much of faith in the judiciary of Sri Lanka, shouldn't people also have faith in the law enforcement authorities here in Sri Lanka? Because if the judiciary has oversight, true, it'll be great. There's checks and balances. But isn't it also the responsibility of law enforcement authorities to enforce the law properly, to enforce the law fairly? Isn't it? Shouldn't we
certainly, Shalan, idealistically, that's how it should be. But is that how the incentive system is in the police department? Is that how the police department works? Is that how they give promotions? So that's the problem. That's the problem we have. So we have one group of people, the judges, who have a different set of training, different set of values, and different set of incentives. And then we have another group of people who have a different set of training and different set of experience and different set of incentives. That's why things like the National Police Commission are important, independent police commissions are important. If we have that, then we are certainly going in the right direction.
So we've been shouting for a long time saying repeal PTA, bring something better, and whenever something better like or you know, something to replace the PTA with, like the Counter-Terrorism Act is brought, still there are groups that go and say no, this is not better, this is worse, this is bad, this is wrong. Do you think it will be more productive?
With your permission, can we direct that question to Bhavani?
To Bhavani, yes, please.
Yeah, it was actually
do you think it will be better for us to maybe look at reforming the police commission, like Mr. Hizbullah pointed out, instead of just saying repeal PTA, which is, you know, the song that we've been singing for the past couple of decades?
But it shouldn't be either or. You know, that's what I'm saying. In terms of reforms, legislative reform alone is not going to address the problems. You have to have a mix of legislative reform as well as structural reform, and also the thinking that people just assume this security apparatus and going back to emergency laws, for example, is the norm. It's not the norm. These are exceptional situations that should be treated as exceptional situations. It's just unfortunately become normalized. So your point about counter-terror laws, for example, I mean, unfortunate that 2018, 2019, that opportunity was missed, but it wasn't missed purely because people were critical. I think you need to have, in a functioning democracy, space for debate and different opinions. And I think that debate is very healthy because, for example, we thought a counter-terror law that's improved, not the law that was, not the bill that was presented, but something that was improved could have actually been a step forward. And not because of the judicial oversight that it addressed in terms of what's there in the PTA, we also suggested that there be oversight by the legislature. So oversight by two arms, that's the judiciary and parliament, over the executive. And it goes back to the point he just raised about law enforcement. Law enforcement is the executive arm. So when there is impunity and malpractices from one arm, I don't think as good as the judiciaries of intelligence, of law enforcement, and reporting back and ensuring that abuse doesn't happen. Now, if that is addressed, we could address some of these things. But the whole point about the Independent Police Commission, I think, is also critical. We saw that their importance, for example, in 2018 during the constitutional coup period, when there were attempts to do transfer individuals, and the police commission came in. Now, an independent institution, not just the police commission, the human rights commission, different entities, if they're truly independent, should be a check on the executive arm as well, should be able to hold them account. So I think you not just law reform, but a whole gamut of reforms need to come in. But that said, we can't also wait for that perfect moment. I think if anything we can learn from is that perfect moment will never materialize. So we need to keep pushing for a whole gamut of things, but be also ready in terms of engaging. It goes back to the point, do we trust the politicians who can do
Bhavani,
that
like
job?
you said, these commissions are supposed to be checks and balances, supposed to impose checks and balances on the executive. But now, a fact that we know, Chamatka, turning to you, is that during the history of Sri Lanka, politicians, the executive, members of the executive have not been too keen on having checks and balances. They believe that the best way to run this country is with a free arm, so that they can, you know, implement what is best for the country or what they believe is best for the country, no matter the cost. Do you think that the Samagijana Balavegia this time around, with a little bit of a changed composition, moving away from the United National Party, would act differently if and when they come into power?
If you look at the 21st Amendment that was presented to Parliament by the SJB as a private member's bill and was later presented to court, I think you could see SJB stand on the executive and how it wanted to curtail the powers of the executive. And and impose checks and balances so that the legislature and the judiciary plays its due role. You'd understand the position the SJB has on an executive with unlimited powers. As for the constitutional amendments that have happened so far, from the 1st to the 22nd, it's been to serve political needs of the time. That's something I personally believe. And I think it's time, without, you know, scrapping something and including something new, it's time that this country has a new constitution, something similar to what the SJB proposed, which supposedly couldn't be done without asking the public, right? So without going into a referendum. So the SJB stance on the executive, like you asked, has been very clear. And personally, if you look at democracies around the world, Charlan, democracies where the executive is very powerful has often led to authoritarian regimes and abusers of power, as with Sri Lanka over the years. So if we want to move into the 21st century and be a real parliamentary democracy, as we claim to be, I think it's important that we curb the powers of the executive.
But it seems as, sorry.
Mr. Vijay Bandara, I think it's only fair that since we asked Samatka the same question, I relate it to you as well. How does the NPP view this? How do you intend to ensure that there are significant checks and balances between...
Jaima, to add to that, there's a question from the audience for Mr. Vijay Bandara as well, along those lines. How does you said that your party was proposing a new constitutional amendment or reform, is what you said. How does the new constitution aid in the effective use of the PTA?
Yes, now with regard to PTA, now even in the existing constitution, Article 155 provides President to promulgate emergency.
Yes.
If a Security Council and intelligence sector functioning properly and they are on alert, if those are briefed to the President and the Security Council, President has a mechanism instead of this PTA Act to declare emergency and enact relevant regulation. Constitution to provide that, Article 15(7), emergency regulation in an extreme required situation. So why do we need PTA? No need at all. Now, we were discussing that there are rationale behind this also, we need to protect the country. And that is, the mechanism is there already in the Constitution. Constitution, Supreme Law itself provides for that. Therefore, without using this mechanism, just passing a piece of legislation and giving power to the whim and fancies of the executive president or the Minister of Defense, what is happening?
So, Mr. Hizbullah, do you think, relating to that, drawing on that, do you think successive governments have shied away from repealing the PTA is because they want to keep the law to use it as a tool should the need arise?
Yes.
You see that happening now?
Yes, because
they did.
Because I want to also draw this to your attention. I feel like, personally, I feel like there seems to be a misconception in terms of counter-terrorism. Because since this was introduced in 1979, we have had several uprisings and revolts and violence happening in the country, which could have been, or which is, indiscriminate violence towards the citizens of Sri Lanka. However, the PTA wasn't used to charge those who were involved in that violence. Yes. Let's take the 1983 pogrom. Let's take the anti-Muslim riots that happened in 2000. Yes, in Akurana and thereabouts. So, I believe personally that successive governments have shied away from repealing the PTA so as to use it as a tool if the need arises, like we saw in recent months. What is your stance on this?
You're absolutely correct. The evidence is to that effect. I don't have the exact numbers right at this point in time, but during the Akurana, Digana crisis or the attacks, a large number of mosques were burned down.
Yes.
That's standard PTA offense.
Yes.
Who was under the PTA? The leaders of those various balakayas who publicly claimed that they were preparing groups and armies and so many balakayas. It was a normal law that was applied. So So and that's again the problem here, that this is a law that is used selectively to targeted groups and targeted persons and not applied to others. So that I think is I think one of the reasons why it's not repealed, because we have a little chainsaw that we have in our hand to use it when we want to.
Bhavani, sorry, Shania, go ahead.
I'm just going to throw in some audience questions. So the act is ostensibly for the prevention of terror. Therefore, can it be used to arrest a person after the act of terror? That's the question.
Yes.
Isn't the penal code sufficient for that?
Penal code is sufficient also because all the PTA offences are actually penal code offences. The PTA does not define what terrorism is. It only says unlawful activity, and that's a very vague and broad thing. But the real offences that are set out in section 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on are all PTA offences, all penal code offences. So these are, and that's where the discrimination happens. When we want, we apply the PTA. When we want, we apply the penal code.
PTA itself is an offensive weapon.
now let's say, Mr. Vijay Bandara, the government brings in a piece of legislation to Parliament. Now that requires a simple majority.
Yes.
How will the NPP and the SJB act in Parliament when this is tabled?
I mean, to repeal PTA?
No, now they will bring in a new piece of legislation.
To replace the PTA, they will bring counterterrorism
laws or
what
whatever
would
in a new name.
response
It will come in a new name. So what would be the position of the
to replace,
NPP?
I cannot comment whether we are going to vote in favor or against, because without seeing that. But line of thinking that if whatever the law, even this existing PTA or new law, if it creates a situation where a person or group of person can act above the law, we will not be voting.
Right.
Because the very cardinal principle as far as our party is concerned, the entire problem that we have been suffering for very long, so we are, entire country is trying to find a solution, not economic. I'm talking on the law and good governance. So then we need a good constitution that can minimize the bending of the law.
Where no one is above the law.
Exactly.
So just one final question, because we're now nearing the end of the program for today. Bhavani, now with so many adverse consequences brought about by the PTA, not just locally as far as the dissent from the general public is at this stage right now, but also internationally. We're being ostracized from the international community. We've given multiple assurances to the European Union, to the United Nations Council, that we will not use the PTA, that we will repeal the PTA. Please continue to give us the GSP Plus concession. So against such a backdrop, I know you are not, a psychic or something to read the minds of those in power, but honestly, what do you think the government is thinking when they use this act?
Is that a serious question?
Yes.
Shalin, I honestly don't know, because I was surprised when the DOs were issued in July against the 3 protest stand, why the president felt he had to sign those DOs as Minister of Defense when the ordinary laws could have been used to detain them, to question them. So really, it goes back to a fundamental question. Is who is driving decision making in this government? I think that is something we haven't asked, and I think that goes to the fact of even the direction of reforms. Why is PTA reforms not happening, or why is the PTA still in existence, or why is the PTA being used in the way it's being used, arbitrary? I think the question is who is making the decisions. It goes also back to a point that he just raised about attacks against the Muslim community. In 2018, 2014, 2018, 2019, we saw a whole spate of ethno-religious violence. Ethno-religious violence that could have been stopped. There was evidence of who was perpetrating. There was evidence of incitement. Who was arrested? Who was charged? Or who wasn't charged? Who was given protection? So those questions goes back to who is behind decision making And then the impunity and this thing that he just raised at the very beginning, the confidence with which certain people operate because they know the law will never touch them. So it goes back to another key thing that we didn't talk about is particular strengthening institutions. And we spoke about independent commissions, but one issue one institution that is fundamental, and it was raised post the Easter Sunday attacks, is the role of the National Security Council. The National Security Council ideally should have a critical role in decisions of security, but also having conversations that it's not limited to one or two individuals or institutions. Reform of the National Security Council should have happened after what transpired post Easter Sunday attacks and what came about in the Parliament Select Committee. That didn't happen. So law reforms, institutions, all of that need to happen, but I think asking the question, who is making the decisions?
Bhavani, before we close, I just have one question. I just want to take this overseas. Regarding the international community, what fingers are they pointing at us? Is the issue the act in itself, or is it the abuse of the act? Because you have counterterrorism law in the West as well. The US has the Patriot Act. Canada and France have very active counterterrorism law. So what exactly are they alleging against us?
So it depends who you're looking at. But for example, the EU is asking for the repeal of the PTA and replacing it with a counter-terror law that meets international standards. And that's a debate we can go into on a separate show. But again, it goes back to what is needed in Sri Lanka and what can be done. And I think this point that we didn't raise is in February, the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka said, repeal the PTA and bring in terrorism through the penal code. Now, again, some will say that's not sufficient, we need to look at different things, but it goes back to a particular point we've all been making, is we have sufficient laws in Sri Lanka. Of course, these laws need to be updated, amended, but also monitored, scrutinized, because a law in itself is not going to address these things. But let's look at the existing laws and look at the international standards and see what needs to be done. Repealing PTA, I think, is pretty much everyone, at least in this room, would say needs to go. What replaces it needs to be really carefully done, because something that has been also brought in is we can't react. When something happens, we react. When labels are made, then people's narratives, mindsets also change. It has to be done carefully, which is something we have missed so many times. But international experiences alone is not going to help our context. So we need to find our own way. But if the Human Rights Commission is saying that we can use existing laws, but bring in definitions that address new issues, let's look at that. Why are we not doing it?
What is important is that I think, like Mr. Hijaz Hizbullah pointed out, for us to have a society that we can be pleased to live in, where we don't have to be scared to go out and do what we want and say what we need to say. Just for the benefit of our viewers, since we are now coming to the close of the program, just to summarize a little bit of what was discussed on the Prevention of Terrorism Act specifically. We did go out of bounds a little bit here and there because all of these matters are connected to good governance. With regard to the PTA specifically, some of the issues that were identified today in this discussion was the issue of arbitrary detention. I think that has been a perennial issue of the PTA that has been discussed in length. Also forced confessions that led, in this case, what was specifically pointed out was that led to misleading information being used, and the people of Sri Lanka, or the general public of Sri Lanka, suffering massive calamities like the April 21st attacks. Counterproductive outcomes of the PTA, as was pointed out by Mr. Hijaz Hizbullah. Also, with regard to torture in exacting these forced confessions was also discussed. Also, the fact that the PTA has contributed to destroying many lives of people in Sri Lanka as they have been held on trial for an extended period of time, some for even 16 years, and then acquitted from all charges. So necessarily people are being held after they have not done anything or not committed any offenses. And the solutions that were proposed on this program as we look forward into the coming years was bringing about systematic change, not just repealing the PTA and replacing with something else, but bringing in systematic change, strengthening institutions, strengthening independent commissions like the Police Commission and the Judicial Services Commission, which is already pretty strong. And we spoke about the role of judicial oversight over matters concerning the prevention of terrorism, to have more judicial oversight, and also to bring about systematic change in the police department and other law enforcement authorities that are supposed to use acts like the PTA to enforce the law. Shamir?
Thank you very much, Shalan, for that summarizing the solutions as far as this discussion was concerned. The way forward, of course, is to bring in a new piece of legislation that would enable Sri Lankan citizens to look at the judiciary very positively. So thank you very much, Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, Attorney at Law Hijaz Hizbullah, Attorney at Law Shamatka Ratnayaka, as well as Attorney at Law J. Mujib Bandar for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Thank you very much, Shanaya. Thank you very much, Shalan. And thank you very much, Jayamal, for posing very important questions to our panelists this evening on the show. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. Change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future. Take care and good night.